So welcome everyone to my talk, which is entitled, Can Machines Perceive Emotion? I really would like to thank Alish Martinez, my friend and colleague and collaborator on a recent paper, for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. What I'm going to be presenting is a really high-level overview of a domain of work that all of us are interested in. But I'm not going to be going into the details of any experiments, and there are several topics which could benefit from being entire talks in their own right. And so I'll try to flag those for you and direct you to relevant resources. This is really just an overview to give you a flavor of the topics that I think are important when considering how to build AI that can eventually infer the emotional states that people are in. So lots of tech companies are trying to figure out how to detect emotion by reading facial expressions. It's a really exciting time in this technology because things are developing really quickly at an ever increasing pace. And in fact, there are lots and lots of gadgets, apps, and algorithms now that are attempting to detect emotion. But is it really possible for this technology to read emotion in a person's face or body or vocalizations? Plenty of companies are claiming to have already done it. And so what should we make of these claims? What I'm going to suggest to you today is that these claims are based on some fundamental assumptions about the nature of emotion, which are profoundly mistaken. And the punchline here is to offer a friendly warning, a warning that will challenge maybe some deeply held beliefs that some of you hold. The first point is that if the news stories are to be believed, and companies really are claiming that they can read emotions in human faces and bodies, then those companies are misrepresenting what they can do. And the second part of my message is not that machines can't perceive emotion, but more that affective computing may be going about this in the wrong way because of a fundamental misunderstanding of what emotions are and how they work. And as a consequence, we might all be missing a game-changing opportunity to make seminal discoveries about the nature of emotion. So here are a set of facial poses. I'll refer to them as facial configurations. These come from the work of Paul Ekman, and these are considered by many people to be either the universal expressions of emotion or prototypic expressions that people usually make when they're feeling angry and fearful and disgusted, afraid, happy, and sad. And these are the expressions, these configurations are the expressions that companies are using when they assess a person's emotional state. But consider this evidence. Here are the facial configurations that are assumed to express emotion: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. But how frequently do people actually make these faces when they express emotion? Well, the answer from recent meta-analyses is not so much. The y-axis here represents the average proportion of times that people make these facial movements during actual emotional events. So let's zoom in on anger, for example. In real life, people scowl about 30% of the time, like 28%, so about 30% of the time, meaning that they're moving their faces in a variety of other ways, meaningful ways, when they're angry about 70% of the time. Now, 28% of the time is more than chance. So it's not the case that they never scowl in anger. They're scowling in anger about 30% of the time, which is what scientists would call low reliability. And I should point out that we're talking about Western subjects here, subjects in large-scale urban cultures. But if they're only scowling about 30% of the time, then that means that 70% of the time they're doing something else with their face that's really meaningful. They might widen their eyes and gasp in anger. They might frown in anger. They might cry in anger. They might even smile in anger. And conversely, people scowl when they're not angry and when they're not even emotional. Sometimes people scowl when they're concentrating. Sometimes people scowl when somebody else tells a bad joke. Sometimes people scowl when they have gas. Nevertheless, there are hundreds of studies where test subjects are shown posed photographs like these faces and are asked to identify the emotion being portrayed. And again, the proportions are found on the y-axis. Now that's quite a difference. I mean, look at these discrepancies. So on average, people may scowl about 30% of the time when they're angry, but perceivers infer the presence of anger about 65% of the time when they see a scowl. And which data are companies using? Well, they're using the blue bars. When their software detects someone scowling, they infer that the person is angry. When their software detects someone frowning, they infer the presence of sadness, and so on. Now, scientifically speaking, why are the blue bars so much higher than the white bars? Well, let me show you. Here's the kind of experiment that is almost always used in the sorts of studies that generate those blue bars. Test subjects are shown a face like this and a small list of words like this, and they're asked to select the word that best matches the face. In this case, it's anger. When test subjects choose the expected word from the list, it's called accuracy. And hundreds of studies show very high accuracy using this method, which is called choice from array. Emotion perception in these cases feels like you're reading a word on a page because, in fact, that's exactly what you're doing. Because in studies where we take the words away and we just show these faces to test subjects and say, please label how this person feels, the average accuracy plummets to about 33%. And for some emotion categories like contempt or shame or embarrassment, the rates drop to about chance levels, which is about 17%. And then look what happens when we bring a little cultural diversity into the picture. So this is a study where we went to Tanzania to test the Hadza hunter-gatherers. This is a particularly useful population to test because the Hadza, although they're a modern people, live in a foraging environment. They live in a circumstance where they're foraging constantly for their food. So they're living in circumstances that are very similar to our Pleistocene ancestors this is a time when some evolutionary psychologists have claimed that these expressions evolved. So when you show faces to Hadza subjects, test subjects, the rate of accuracy, meaning how often do they pick the correct word, actually drops to about 25%. And if you remove the happy category, which is the only category which is pleasant, it actually drops to about 19%, and I should say 17% is chance. So when you remove the secret ingredient from these experiments, which are the words, you dissolve any evidence for universal emotional expressions. And just so we're clear, I'm going to show you right now a figure which summarizes about 20 years of research on how people in remote small-scale cultures who have limited exposure to Western cultural practices and norms, how do they infer emotional meaning in these posed faces or vocalizations? So here, the vertical axis is the method that was used in the experiment, from the least constrained, where you just show a face or play a vocalization and ask people to freely label, to the most constrained at the bottom, which is where you're providing response alternatives to your test subjects. And along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, I've just separated the experiments into experiments that show no support for universality, weak support, moderate support, and strong support. So here are the original papers that were published by Paul Ekman and his colleagues. Oh, and I should also point out that when I separated into unsupported, weak support, moderate support, and strong support, I'm using criteria that were laid down by Haight and Keltner in their 1999 paper, where non-supported means that people choose, make the correct matching or the expected matching under 20% of the time. Weak support is 20 to 40% of the time. Moderate support is 40 to 70% of the time, and strong support is above 70%. So these are the criteria that in the basic emotion approach that people use to interpret their findings. And so the original findings from Paul Ekman's group were, he had two experiments. He had two peer-reviewed papers with, depending on how you count, a total of 4 or 5 samples, which found moderate to strong support for universality. But then when we look at the evidence across a broader range of time points, meaning in the last 10 years, there have been a number of studies that have been conducted in small scale samples, sampling people from different parts of the world, including from Africa, and using many different methods. And what you can see is that in large part, there's really very little support for the hypothesis that people around the world, particularly in these remote cultures, can see anger in a scowl, and sadness in a frown, and happiness in a smile, and so on. And in particular, again, I just want to draw your attention to the experiments with members of the Hadza culture, because they hold special value for us as a population of people to study, given their hunting gathering methods of living on the African savanna. And just for completeness, we decided in my lab to go back to the original experimental method and confirm that it actually can make any emotion category look universal, even if no one has ever proposed universality for a given emotion category. So the first thing we did is we identified 6 emotion categories from different culture that have never been claimed as universal and that don't exist in English or in the language of the Hadza, Hadzane, using single words. And then we invented expressions for these emotions. Like, we literally just made up a vocal sound for each emotion. So for example, the emotion category giggle is from the Philippines, and it refers to an overwhelming urge to squeeze or pinch something that is unbearably cute. So I'm really familiar with this emotion category. Even though my language doesn't have a word for it, my brain can create this category using conceptual combination, because several people in my lab have just had babies. And we just got a dog, a puppy actually. So I'm very familiar with the urge to, really squeeze the cheeks of something that is very adorable and cute. And so for this category, giggle, we made up a sound that was going to stand in for a universal expression. It was a high-pitched squeal. Eee! You actually heard me do it when I was demonstrating the category instance. And so we basically just made up these sounds, one for each category of emotion. And then we asked our test subjects, again, people from the Hadza culture who live in Tanzania, to match the sound to stories that we told them about each emotion. And we also had people do it in the US, and we also had people do it in China as a control. Those are the control populations. And the average accuracy was 57%, which is not statistically different from the accuracy rates for anger, sadness, fear, disgust, and so on. So when I say 50%, 57%, what I mean is when we show people, we tell people a little story about giggle. This is a category they've never heard of before. And then we play them the made up sound, the made up expression, ee. And then we play them another made up expression, say for ligut, which is intense focus and passionate feeling of energy that's associated with pursuing a challenge, particularly in a group. When we just give them these two sounds, 57% of the time, people chose the squeaky sound that we made up for giggle. They were able to match them at rates that would be interpreted as evidence for universal emotions. So that's where these blue bars come from. Scientists have been using an experimental method that does not discover evidence for universal emotional expressions. They've been using a method that actually manufactures that evidence. And this method is largely responsible for the belief that a scowl is the expression of anger and that a smile is the expression of happiness, and so on. When in fact, a scowl is a expression, one expression of anger. A smile is one expression of happiness, and so on. And so if you want to build AI that perceives emotion in humans, you have to realize that these famous facial configurations do not consistently or specifically display anger, disgust, fear, and so on. Instead, variation is the norm. If we were to summarize the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that have been published, and in fact, this is something that Alish and I did. We spent 2.5 years summarizing really over 1,000 published papers, along with several other of our colleagues. Here's the gist of what we found. I'm going to illustrate it with an example. When you look at this person's face, she looks sad or tired, maybe grieving. But this is actually my daughter, Sophia, experiencing what I can only describe as a profound sense of pleasure. She's actually at the Cologne Chocolate Museum on her second chocolate drink. Now, this little sweetheart is also experiencing a profound sense of pleasure. The lesson here is that people move their faces in many different ways during instances of the same emotion category. And if you just look at this little guy's eyebrow region, you can see that it looks very similar to this, which people often see as expressing anger. But this is actually a photograph of Jim Webb, who in 2006, I believe, won the senatorial race in Virginia, which is a state in the United States, and returned the Senate to Democratic control with this victory. Without context, we see his face as communicating anger because, in fact, this face actually symbolizes anger in our culture. So the lesson here is that people not only move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion category, they also move their faces in exactly the same way during instances of different emotion categories. When it comes to emotion, a face does not speak for itself in real life. This doesn't mean that people move their faces randomly. It means they move their faces in a way that is situated, that's tied to the situation that they're in. So for example, people usually see this face as smugness or pride or confidence, when actually It's supposed to be the universal expression for disgust. And as you can see, actually the two faces are identical. They were just put on different body poses. What's really interesting is that when you do this, and these are experiments done by Hillel Aviezar, brilliant experiments, what you can see is that actually subjects, test subjects actually visually scan the face differently when the wrinkled nose stereotype for disgust is placed on a body that is posing with arms up versus a body that is holding a disgusting, dirty object. The way that subjects are sampling the face actually differs depending on the context in which it's placed. And these expressions, what's up with these expressions? Well, where did they come from? As it turns out, they were not discovered by scientists observing how people express emotion in everyday life. In fact, they were stipulated by a handful of scientists and adopted as universal truth. And then we built a whole science of emotion around them. But actually, they're stereotypes. So companies who are building emotion AI at the moment, who rely on these stereotypes, are basically, using a science of emojis and trying to use it to read or infer emotions in people in everyday life. But we don't want a science that's built on stereotypes, and we don't want AI that is using these stereotypes. We want a science that really tries to measure and capture the variability in the way that people express emotion in the real world. In the real world, an emotion like anger is not an entity. A word like anger refers to a category of highly variable instances that are not random, but that are tied to the specific situation. So you might not shout in anger if you're in a board meeting. You might express anger in some other way. You might not express anger by laughing if you are talking to your boss, but you might express anger by laughing in a different circumstance. And the substantial variability that we see within an emotion category and the similarity that we see in the features across emotion categories, we see that whether we're measuring faces, as I've just discussed, we see it in peripheral physiology. So an increase in heart rate isn't always anger. It also might be fear or happiness or even sadness. In anger, your blood pressure could go up, it could go down, it could stay the same. So when we look at studies of human brain activity, whether we're looking at meta-analyses that are designed to find a single biomarker for each emotion category, or whether we look at multivoxel pattern analysis studies of whole brain data. So we take the brain, divide it up into little three-dimensional cubes called voxels, and then we try to find a pattern of activity in those voxels across the brain that will distinguish anger and fear and sadness and so on. There are a number of those studies now. So when you look at those studies, when you look at studies of intrinsic brain networks, those are networks that are kind of laid down in your brain according to the white matter that's in your brain. When we look at dynamic connectivity between those networks, when we look at single cell studies that are stimulating neurons and then measuring people's emotions, and even when we look in non-human animals or in behavioral ecology and evolutionary robotics, and examining studies in people who have brain lesions, we see basically the same result over and over and over again. And that is, even in most studies which are attempting to find a single biological basis for a single emotion category, what they might imagine to be the prototype of that category, its most frequent or typical instance. Like, what is your brain doing? What is your face doing? What is your body doing during the most frequent or typical instance of anger? What you find is variability. Now, these studies aren't even designed to identify and map variation. These studies are designed to find single biomarkers. Imagine what would happen if we actually designed our studies to try to identify and map the variability that's actually out there. Variability in features like how are people moving their faces? How are physiological signals changing? How is brain activity changing? And so on. And imagine what would happen if we actually studied the variation within a single person over time. That is, we tried to map the vocabulary, the expressive vocabulary of a single individual. These are the kinds of things that we need to do in order to have a viable science of emotion upon which a viable AI, a viable science of emotion AI can be built. Now, I just want to make the point here that there are a number of theoretical views in the science of emotion, and many of those theoretical views permit variation. But only some predict variation in an a priori way. So for example, if we look at this space here, what we see is along the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we can array different theoretical views on how similar the instances within a category are proposed to be. So in mapping this conceptual space, for example, Paul Ekman has proposed that the instances of each emotion category are very similar in their features, their facial expressions, their physical responses, and so on. So the instances within a category will be really similar, and the instances of different categories will be really different. He's also proposed that there is a deep similarity in the instances of the same category. An affect program, for example, which we would call a psychological essence. That is a deep, immutable feature that makes the category what it is. What's interesting is that in the red sort of part of this conceptual space, this corresponds to the hypothesis that emotion categories are classical categories whose features have necessary and sufficient regularity. So there's each category has necessary and sufficient features that would make an instance of emotion a member of that category. There are a whole slew of theoretical views here depicted in the yellow space, which suggests that emotion categories are prototypes, meaning that there would be some degree of similarity in the instances of, meaning that there would be some similarity in the features of each category, but you wouldn't expect every instance of anger to share every single feature, right? So the idea here would be that people don't always scowl in anger, but they usually scowl in anger. They don't always smile in happiness, but they usually smile in happiness. And these views also suggest that there's a single representation in the brain for each category, the prototype. That's what you learn, basically, the prototype. Now, some of these theories propose that there are deep essences like neural circuits or cognitive mechanisms like cognitive appraisals, for example. So, for example, the recent work by Cowan and Keltner, their work suggests that emotions are prototype categories, but they're proposing that these categories are still basic emotions and have a deep immutable essence. Now, classical views of emotion that propose emotion categories to be classical categories permit very little variation from instance to instance within the category. The assumption is that the variation comes from emotion regulation, or it comes from attempts to use display rules, that is to use social desirability to guide the expression of emotion, or that there's a problem with the methodology. Maybe the stimuli that were used to evoke the emotion weren't strong enough, and so on. Prototype views of emotion permit some degree of variation, but there's still the assumption that there's a frequent, most typical instance for a category, and that those instances with those features, that is the prototype, really occur in real life most frequently and most typically. Then there are a whole class of approaches which theoretically predict tremendous variability in the way people move their faces, in the way that people, in the way that bodily changes occur, in the brain basis of emotion, that within a given category, what you see is variability in all the features, not in a random way, but in a way that's tied to the specific situation. And that's what we see depicted here in the green part of this space. Now, many of you understand the notion of what a category is, right? A category is a group of things which are similar in some way. Here we have a group of cats. The category cat has a bunch of instances in it. There's variability in this category. So each instance, each individual in this category don't have exactly the same features, but they all share some typical set of features. That's the idea, right? So cats can vary in their size. Maybe they're big, maybe they're small. Cats can vary in eye color, right? Cats can vary in terms of the thickness and color of their fur, or whether they even have fur at all. And when the human brain is attempting to categorize these all as cats, we kind of ignore this variation in favor of what all the cats have in common. But here's the thing. The categories that we deal with in everyday life are not defined by mere physical similarities. They're defined by the function that the category is being used for in a given situation. So for example, when I ask you to think of a cat and you're in a pet store, your brain is going to construct the image of a cat that will be a good pet. And if I ask you to think of a cat after you've seen a mouse in your kitchen, then maybe your brain will conjure a cat who's really good at catching mice. And if I ask you to think of a cat when you're in a zoo, you get the picture, right? What about a cool cat on the prowl, or just a really cool cat? The best example of the category cat, that is the prototype of the category, changes actually depending on the function of cat in a given situation. When I ask you to think of so for example, if I ask you to think of a bird when you're at a dinner table at a restaurant, you might say a chicken or a turkey. If I ask you to think of a bird when you're in a pet store, you might think of a parrot or a finch. If you're in the park and I ask you to think of a bird, you might think of a sparrow or a robin. If you were living in South America, you might think of a peacock. So basically what your brain is doing is it's tailor-making your category in the instance as you need it to fit the situation that you're in. Your brain combines what you know to make a category that fits the situation that you're in. And this is basically the operating principle of your brain. And your brain can even make completely novel categories. So for example, here are three things. They don't look alike. They don't feel the same. So their physical properties vary. But everyone in the modern world is familiar with the category that these things belong to in a given situation. So for example, if you are in an airport, these things become the things that you can't take through airport security. If you were in a park, a zoo that has a park, or a park that has animals in it, then these might be things that shoot water. The point here is really that We treat emotion, the question of emotion perception, of inferring emotion in other people, as a classification problem, but it's not a classification problem. It's a category construction problem. The brain is constantly doing a kind of clustering in order to figure out what a particular set of facial movements means, or what a particular change in the body means. So in this culture, we've learned to construct a category for anger in a variety of situations, transforming physical movements, mere physical movements, a scowl, a cry, a stone-faced stare, a sly smile, into something with emotional meaning, an expression of anger, or an expression of sadness, or an expression of happiness. And this allows us to predict what might happen next. So if you want to teach a machine to perceive emotions in a human, it has to learn to construct categories on the fly. And that's the punchline. Perceiving emotions is not a classification problem. It's a category construction problem. And it's a category construction problem whether you measure facial movements, vocal acoustics, physiology in the body, neural activity in the brain, or all of them. Physical changes by themselves have no inherent emotional meaning. Something or someone has to impose meaning on them, right? A heart rate increase is not fear. It can become fear when it's serving a particular function in a particular situation. And so accuracy is really, if you and I were in an interaction and my heart rate is increasing and my brain is about to direct my face to move in a particular way, my brain is categorizing those signals. Your brain is categorizing those signals. And so accuracy really is the question of whether or not both of us are constructing the same category in that instance. I'm constructing a category without my knowledge. My brain's just doing it automatically. So is yours. And if they match, then you're going to be predicting most likely what I do next well enough so that our conversation can continue uninterrupted. So emotions are not built into the brain at birth. They are built by the brain, by your brain, as you need them in a situated fashion. Now, my lab studies how brains do category construction. That's a whole other conversation, right? That in and of itself is probably a series of several talks that I don't really have time to go into the details today. But if you go to my website, if you go to my academic website, you'll find many, many, many papers there which discuss our hypotheses and our findings. Some of those are summarized in my book that you can see listed on the screen. And if you go to my public website, lisafeldmanbarrett.com, you'll see a number of talks where I go over our working hypotheses for how the brain is solving this category construction problem and creating instances of emotion and instances where we are perceiving other people's emotions. The take-home point that I want you to leave with today is that the study of emotion, the scientific study of emotion, has to change. It has to change in specific ways for basic scientists to be able to give computer scientists and vision scientists and generally the people who work on emotion AI the kind of information that they need in order to build emotion inference systems. The thing is, in order for us to do the kind of research that we need, we really need to partner with people who have the technology to be able to do the measurement of variation at the scale that's necessary in order to solve this problem. In psychology right now, we try typically to observe emotions as mechanistic systems in experiments. So what we'll do is we'll isolate a single variable and then manipulate it and try to observe the effect that it has. And we assume that it has a strong effect that's easy to replicate, right? So we might expose people to images of snakes or spiders, and we assume that if we do that, that this will have a very strong effect and cause fear. If we want to induce happiness, that we will show people an image of a baby or a flower or food. The assumption is that the stimulus is sufficient to have a very strong effect, an effect that's easy to replicate. Historically, experiments try to reduce variation in effects so that they are easy to replicate. And they try to basically reduce variability. So, for example, in studies of emotion perception, we give people exactly the same facial pose posed by different actors, right? So everyone is scowling in anger, everyone is smiling in happiness. When we ask people to imagine how might you express anger, we give them an anger scenario that is one anger scenario for everyone that has no context in it, like someone stole your bike. How would you? Someone stole your bike. You're angry. How would you feel? There may be a small amount of variation from instance to instance, but this is usually assumed to be an issue with the accuracy of measurement rather than the complexity of causation. The evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin has observed that this approach to science doesn't really work for biology because living organisms are complex systems with lots and lots and lots of nonlinear interacting parts. So in biology, any single variable has a weak effect on the outcome that scientists are trying to measure. And more importantly, you can't manipulate one variable and assume that all the other variables remain unaffected. And so what I want to suggest is that the same is true for psychology, and particularly for the psychology of emotion. There's a combinatorial explosion in the causal patterns and in the outcomes, and therefore tremendous variation in organisms that make up a biological category like a species, and that make up a biological category like anger or sadness or fear. And Lewontin further suggests that any attempt to understand causes has to necessarily involve the observation of variation. And I'm suggesting that this is true for the science of emotion. We have to embrace variation and not try to contain it. And this is the only way that we're going to be able to build a viable science of emotion and a viable science of emotion AI. Now, you know, Darwin fortunately gave us a tool for investigating and understanding variability. It's called population thinking, so named by the evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. Population thinking means that a biological category is a population of highly variable instances. Variation among individual instances, so here, variations in Olympians, this variation is real and important in nature. Whereas the type that describes the category is just an abstraction and might not exist in nature at all. So in population thinking, the mean is an abstraction. It's artificial. The variability is what's real. And in typical laboratory experiments of emotion, typically, no matter what you're measuring, if you're measuring the body, if you're measuring the brain, if you're measuring the voice or the face, typically what's happening is that scientists restrict the emotional episodes that are sampled. They might sample a very small number of instances from each emotion category. They analyze the data from small samples of subjects. They assume that the statistical summary is a good estimate of individual responses. This is why people refer to scowls as expressions of anger. This is why people refer to anger as an emotion, as if it's one thing, rather than a population of instances in a category. And typically people ignore the possibility of variation in categories, both within a person, across situations, and across participants. So the take-home message here is that the science of emotion, and really emotion AI, really has to employ a population mindset. We have to embrace variation. Variation among individual people is important, and variation within a person is important. How you experience and express any emotion, the instances of any emotion category, happiness, sadness, fear, awe, gratitude, these are real. This variation is real. It takes place in a variety of contexts, and this is what we have to be targeting in our scientific inquiry. So if we want to be able to build machines that can read emotions in people, we have to appreciate and learn more about the considerable variation in brains and bodies that make those emotions and that perceive those emotions. You can learn more about these ideas and our hypotheses for how individual brains deal with this variability in my book, How Emotions Are Made, and in my new book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which will be released in November of 2020. And again, as I said before, you can go to my website, my public website, where there are a number of talks that have been taped that go into these different topics in more detail. And I'll just end by thanking my fantastic lab, some of whom are pictured here, along with the legions of undergraduate students who help us to run our experiments every semester, as well as, thanking the funding agencies who support our work. And I'll also thank you very much for your attention today.